Let me ask you something honest. How many unfinished projects do you have right now? And I don't mean the ones you're actively working on. I mean the ones in the bag, the ones in the bin, the ones stuffed under the bed or piled in the corner of your craft room that you walk past every single day and quietly feel guilty about. If you just winced a little, good. That means you're exactly the person I made this video for. Because here's what nobody tells you when you first fall in love with sewing. The speed isn't about your hands. It's not about how naturally gifted you are or how long you've been doing this. I've sat across from women who have been sewing for 30 years, and they are still fighting. They're machines, still ripping out the same seams, still spending double the time they should on projects that should take an afternoon. And I've worked with complete beginners who, once they understood a handful of very specific principles, were cutting their project time in half within a week. Speed in sewing is almost entirely a systems problem. It is not a talent problem. It is not an equipment problem, though we will talk about tools today. It is the direct result of how you think about your workflow, your workspace, your cutting, your pressing, and your stitching sequence. Change the system and the speed follows automatically. That is the single most important idea in this entire video, so I want you to hold on to it. Let's start with the single biggest time thief in home sewing, and that is starting and stopping. Every single time you pick up a new piece, rethread your needle, position your fabric, and start a new seam from a dead stop, you are burning time, not dramatic amounts of time individually. Maybe 30 seconds here, a minute there, but across a full project, especially anything with multiple pieces like a quilt, a lined jacket, or a pair of trousers. Those starts and stops add up to a genuinely staggering number. I timed myself once on a simple 12-block quilt top, and I counted 47 individual seam starts. If each one costs me just 45 seconds of repositioning, cutting threads, and re-engaging the fabric, that is 35 minutes of dead time on a project that should have taken 2 hours. The solution to this is chain piecing. And before you tell me you don't quilt so this doesn't apply to you, I need you to hear me out. Chain piecing is not a quilting technique. It is a production technique. It is the exact same principle used on every garment sewn in a factory. The idea is simple. You feed your pieces through the machine one after another without cutting the thread between them. You just let a small bridge of thread connect each piece to the next. Keep feeding, keep sewing, and you cut all the threads at the end. That's it. But the impact of that simple change is enormous because you eliminate the stop-start entirely. Your machine is running continuously. Your hands are always moving forward. Your focus stays in the work instead of constantly resetting. Now, how do you apply this to garments? The same way you'd apply it to quilt blocks. If you're sewing 6 patch pockets, you don't sew one, cut, sew the next. You feed all 6 through in a chain. If you're sewing side seams on multiple pairs of the same pant, chain them. If you're assembling the bodice sections of a dress pattern, any seam that is the same type and same direction gets chained. You group your work before you sit down at the machine. You sort your cut pieces the way a factory floor worker sorts them. Same seam, same direction altogether. Then you sit down and you sew that entire stack without stopping. You're not multitasking, you're batching. And batching is one of the oldest and most effective efficiency principles in any kind of production work. The second technique I want to talk about is stitch length, and I want to be very precise with you here, because this is one of those things that sounds almost too basic to matter, and it is absolutely not basic. The default stitch length on most home sewing machines is somewhere around 2.5 millimeters. That is a perfectly reasonable all-purpose setting for medium-weight woven cotton. But here is what most sewists never learn. You should be changing your stitch length deliberately for every single project based on the fabric weight, the seam purpose, and whether that seam will need to be removed easily or stay permanent. For basting, which is a temporary holding stitch, you want your stitch length at 4 to 5 millimeters. Long, easy-to-pull stitches that give way cleanly when you tug the thread. For structural seams on medium-weight fabric, 2.5 is correct. For fine fabric like silk or a lightweight lawn cotton, you want to go shorter, closer to 1.8 to 2 millimeters, because a longer stitch on a fine fabric creates a loose, loopy seam that does not hold cleanly under stress and tends to pucker. For top stitching, you almost always want to go longer, 3 to 3.5 millimeters, because top stitching is decorative and structural at once, and longer stitches read more cleanly on the surface and have more give. Why does this affect your speed? Because wrong stitch length is one of the top causes of seam failure, puckering, and thread nests, and every one of those problems costs you ripping out time. A thread nest, that horrible lump of tangled thread that sometimes appears on the underside of your fabric when you start a seam, is almost always caused by one of three things. The tension is off, the presser foot pressure is too light at the start, or the stitch length is too long for the fabric weight. When the stitch is too long relative to the fabric, the feed dogs cannot grip and advance the fabric consistently, especially at the very beginning of a seam when you have the least control, and the thread bunches underneath. If you've ever dealt with thread nests, and you've tried adjusting just your tension without fixing your stitch length, that is probably why the problem kept coming back. Here is a fast fix. When you start any seam, hold both your needle thread and your bobbin thread behind the presser foot for the first 3 or 4 stitches. This prevents the machine from pulling those threads down into the throat plate and creating the nest in the first place. It is a 30-year-old industry trick, and it works 100% of the time. You will never pick out a thread nest again if you do this consistently. Now I want to talk about pressing because I genuinely believe that the sewists who have the most beautiful, professional-looking work are not necessarily the best stitchers. They are the best pressers. And pressing is also one of the most overlooked speed techniques because most home sewists press reactively. They press when something looks wrong. They press at the end. They press when they remember to. Professional sewists and production sewists press constantly, in a very specific sequence, and they press before they sew as much as after. Here is the pressing sequence I teach every one of my students, and it never fails. Press before you cut. Press after you cut. Press your seams as you sew them, not at the end of the project. Press your seam allowances open or to the side immediately after stitching while the seam is fresh and the fabric is still warm and cooperative. Then press the right side with a press cloth to set everything flat and crisp before you move to the next step. Why does pressing before you cut matter? Because fabric that has been sitting folded in a bolt or a bag has grain distortion built into it. When you cut on distorted grain, your pieces are slightly off from the moment you cut them. When those pieces are slightly off, your seams don't match cleanly. When your seams don't match, you spend time easing and adjusting and repinning. When you press the fabric flat, you restore the grain. Your cutting is accurate, your pieces match, and your sewing goes straight and clean the first time. Note on steam. I use steam constantly, but I want to be careful here because steam and fiber type interact in ways that can actually damage your work if you're not paying attention. With 100% cotton and cotton blends, steam is your best friend. High heat, plenty of steam, firm pressure with your iron. Cotton responds beautifully and holds a pressed crease almost permanently. With superwash wool, which is a wool that has been treated to be machine washable, you can use steam, but you need to be gentler. Because the superwash treatment changes the fiber structure and aggressive steam can cause the fabric to stretch and distort. With regular untreated wool, steam is wonderful, but you lift and press rather than sliding the iron. Sliding on wool felts and stretches the surface. With any synthetic or synthetic blend, and this includes many quilting cottons that have a polyester component, you lower your heat setting significantly because synthetics melt. I have ruined more than one project by forgetting I had a synthetic blend interfacing under a fabric I thought was pure cotton. Test your iron temperature on a scrap every single time you switch fabric types. That is not optional if you want to protect your work. Speaking of interfacing, let me mention Steam seam because if you are not using it, and you do any kind of applique, quilted patchwork, For garment construction that requires a fusible layer, it will change your life. Steam-A-Seam is a double-stick fusible web. Unlike regular fusible interfacing that only bonds on one side, Steam-A-Seam has a light tack on both sides before you apply heat. This means you can position it, reposition it, get it exactly where you want it, and it will hold in place while you fuse it permanently. For applique work, this is a complete game changer. Instead of pinning, basting, adjusting, repinning, you position, press, done. It cuts your applique prep time by 60 to 70% easily. Let's talk about cutting, because this is where I see home sewists lose the most time outside of the machine itself. The typical home cutting setup looks something like this. You unfold your fabric on a table or on the floor. You lay out your paper pattern pieces. You pin them down one by one. You cut around each piece with shears, remove the pins, fold everything back up, and repeat. That process is slow, not a little slow, dramatically slow. And the pinning step in particular is one of the biggest culprits, because pinning distorts your fabric slightly every single time you push a pin through it, and those tiny distortions accumulate across a project with many pieces. The professional cutting method uses weights instead of pins. Pattern weights. You can buy them or you can make them. I have used everything from purpose-made cast iron sewing weights to hockey pucks wrapped in felt to small river stones I found on a walk. The idea is that you place a weight on each pattern piece to hold it flat against the fabric without piercing the fabric at all. Your fabric lies perfectly flat. Your pattern piece lies perfectly flat. You cut with a rotary cutter rather than shears, running it right along the edge of the paper piece in one smooth, continuous stroke. The cut is cleaner, faster, and more accurate than anything you can get with shears and pins. Now, the rotary cutter is the other half of this equation, and I want to talk about blade size for a moment, because it matters more than most people think. The standard rotary cutter blade is 45 millimeters, and that is a good all-purpose size. But for cutting curves, which you get constantly in garment sewing, the 28 millimeter blade is dramatically more precise, because the smaller circumference allows it to follow the curve of a pattern piece without the blade wanting to straighten out and cut straight when the line bends. And for cutting through multiple layers of heavy fabric, the 60 millimeter blade does that work faster and with less hand fatigue, because the larger blade needs less downward pressure to cut cleanly. Change your blades more often than you think you need to. A dull rotary blade drags, distorts the fabric as it cuts, and makes you apply more pressure, which makes your cuts less accurate. A sharp blade glides. The difference between a fresh blade and a blade that has been used for 3 or 4 large projects is the difference between cutting butter and cutting cold clay. I replace my blades after every major project or after roughly 8 hours of cutting time. New blades are inexpensive. The time you waste fighting a dull blade is not. The other cutting tool I want to mention, and this is the one I promised you a few minutes ago that most sewists overlook entirely, is adding machine tape, also sometimes called calculator tape or register tape. It is that thin paper that comes on a roll, and it costs almost nothing. Here is how I use it. When I have a pattern with a straight edge that I need to cut repeatedly, like waistband pieces, waistband interfacing, border strips for a quilt, or any rectangular pattern piece, I measure and mark the dimensions directly onto the adding machine tape, cut the tape to that size, and use the tape strip as my cutting guide laid directly on the fabric. Because the tape is thin and slightly translucent, I can see my fabric grain through it and line it up perfectly every time. Because it is on a roll, I can cut as many identical guides as I need in about 30 seconds flat. Now I want to shift to something that lives inside your seams and inside the invisible parts of your work, because this is where real quality and real speed intersect. Every seam you sew has 2 jobs. The first job is structural. It holds the pieces together. The second job is finished. It prevents the raw edge from fraying, and it makes the inside of the work look clean and professional. Most home sewists treat those 2 jobs as 2 separate steps. They sew the seam, then they finish the edge later, sometimes much later, sometimes never. And that separation is costing them time. The production solution is to sew and finish the seam in one step wherever possible. The most practical tool for this at home is the serger, also called an overlocker. A serger trims the seam allowance, wraps the raw edge in a looped thread cage, and locks it in one pass. If you have a serger, you already know this. But here is what I see serger owners do wrong consistently. They use their serger to finish edges after sewing the seam on the regular machine. That is the slow way. The fast way is to use your serger as your primary construction machine for the seams that don't need precision, like side seams on knit garments, the inner and outer leg seams on pants, or straight construction seams on casual woven garments. You sew and finish simultaneously. Your seam allowance is automatically trimmed to a consistent width, and you cut your construction time by 30 to 40% on any project where this applies. If you don't have a serger, there is still a one-step solution available to you, and it uses your regular machine. It is the French seam, and I want to walk you through it in real detail because it is widely misunderstood. Most people think a French seam is just a nice finishing technique for delicate fabrics. It is actually one of the strongest, cleanest, and most efficient seam constructions available for any lightweight to medium-weight woven fabric. And contrary to what people assume, it is not slower than a regular seam with a separate edge finish. It is faster. Here is the precise method. You place your fabric pieces with the wrong sides together, which is the opposite of how you normally sew. A seam. You stitch at a narrow seam allowance, about 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters. Press that seam open. Then fold the fabric so now the right sides are together, enclosing that first line of stitching completely inside the fold. Press the fold sharp. Stitch again at 3/8 of an inch or about 10 millimeters from the fold. That is your finished seam. The raw edges are completely enclosed inside the seam itself. There is nothing to fray. There is nothing to trim separately. The inside of your garment looks as clean as the outside. And because you are pressing between the two stitching lines, you are doing your pressing in context, which means you don't have a separate pressing step at the end. The time adds up differently than you expect. French seams are ideal for any lightweight woven, sheer fabric, or natural fiber that frays aggressively like linen. Linen frays almost immediately when you cut it, and a French seam on linen is the most efficient solution I have ever found for keeping that under control without adding a separate serging or zigzag step. Speaking of zigzag, I want to address that briefly because the zigzag stitch as an edge finish is the most commonly taught option in beginner sewing, and it is also one of the least effective. The problem is that a standard zigzag stitch, even a tight one, does not prevent fraying. It slows fraying. The raw threads inside the zigzag can still work loose with washing and wear. And because the zigzag stitch has horizontal width, it can sometimes cause the seam allowance to tunnel or distort slightly, which affects how your seams lie flat. If you are going to use your regular machine for edge finishing and you don't have a serger, use a 3-step zigzag instead of a standard zigzag. The 3-step zigzag, sometimes called a serpentine stitch on older machines, takes 3 stitches per zigzag point instead of 1, and this distributes the stitch more evenly along the fabric edge, reducing distortion and providing a much more secure wrap around the raw fibers. It will not look as clean as a serged edge, but it is substantially more effective than a standard zigzag, and it lies flatter in your seam allowance. Now here is the seam finishing trick I promised you earlier in this video, the one I learned from the production sewist who had spent years on a factory floor. And I want to set it up properly because the context matters. In ready-to-wear production, finishing speed is everything. A factory sewist does not have time to serge every seam separately and then go back and press it. The process has to be continuous. The method she taught me is called the flat-felled seam, and I know some of you just thought, I know what a flat-felled seam is, that's on jeans. And you're right. What most sewists don't know is how to sew it efficiently. And the efficient version is genuinely different from the decorative version you see in most tutorials. Here is the fast version. Sew your seam with right sides together at your standard seam allowance. Press both seam allowances to one side, not open to the side. Trim the bottom seam allowance, the one against the fabric, to half its original width. Fold the top seam allowance over and around the trimmed one, enclosing it completely. Press that fold flat. Then stitch right along the folded edge through all layers. You now have a seam that is fully enclosed, completely flat and secured with two parallel lines of stitching. It will not fray, it will not roll, it will not come apart. This is structurally stronger than any other seam construction you can do on a home machine without a serger. And it is not just for denim. It is beautiful on any sturdy woven fabric, and it is genuinely faster than sewing, then serging, then pressing separately once you have the technique in your hands. The key detail that makes the fast version actually fast is the trimming step. You must trim that lower seam allowance cleanly and consistently. If you leave it uneven, your fold over will be uneven, and you will spend more time pressing to get it flat. Use your best small scissors for this, something sharp and precise like an embroidery scissors or a small dressmaker's shear. The trim needs to be done in one clean pass. That clean trim is what makes the enclosure sit flat without pressing into position a dozen times. Trim it clean once, and the seam nearly folds itself. I want to talk for a few minutes now about your sewing sequence on a larger project, because even if every individual technique I have described is working perfectly, you can still lose enormous amounts of time by sewing your project in the wrong order. And the wrong order is almost never obvious from just reading a pattern. Pattern instructions are written to be correct, not to be fast. They walk you through the construction in a logical sequence that ensures you don't make assembly errors. But that sequence is often not optimized for efficiency. Here is the mental model I use. Before I sew a single seam, I read through the entire pattern and I identify every seam that is the same type. Straight seams with the same seam allowance, curved seams in the same direction, top-stitched edges, basted edges. I group them. I write them down in a list if the project is complex. Then I reorganize my sewing order so that I am batching every seam type together. All my basting in one session, all my structural straight seams in a chain piecing session, all my top stitching in one session, all my pressing in one session. This batching approach keeps you in one physical and mental mode at a time. You are not constantly switching between basting and top stitching and pressing and cutting. You sit down to the machine and you do one kind of work until it is done. Your speed builds within each session because you are not resetting your mental and physical attention every few minutes. The number of times you have to change press or feet decreases dramatically. The number of times you have to rethread it or change thread color decreases dramatically. These are small savings individually, but across a full project they are significant. There is also a psychological benefit to this method that I do not want to underestimate. When you batch your work, you can see clear progress at every stage. You finish basting and you have a visible, tangible, completed phase. You finish your main construction seams and you have another visible, tangible, completed phase. That sense of progress is one of the most powerful forces working in your favor when you're trying to push through a big project and stay motivated. Stalled projects almost always stall because the sewist hit a moment where they could not see the progress, and the pile of remaining work felt overwhelming. A batched workflow almost eliminates that feeling because you are always finishing something. Let me bring it back to the workspace for a moment, because everything I have described today depends on having your tools where your hands can reach them without standing up, turning around, or walking across the room. I am not talking about a large space or an expensive setup. I am talking about proximity and organization. Your iron should be within arm's reach of your machine, or as close to it as your setup allows. Your scissors should be on a hook or a magnetic strip attached to the edge of your table, not in a drawer. Your seam ripper should be clipped to your machine, or sitting in a small cup directly in front of you. Your thread should be on a vertical spool holder, so you can see all of your colors at a glance. Your current project pieces, sorted and stacked in sewing order, should be to your left or right within reach. Every time you stand up to retrieve a tool, you break your flow, not just physically but mentally. You re-enter the project from a cold start when you sit back down. Professional sewists call this flow state, and once you are in it, your output per hour goes up dramatically. Protecting your flow state is not a luxury. It is a core efficiency strategy. I rearranged my workspace 3 times before I found a configuration that let me stay seated through an entire chain piecing session, without reaching for anything I didn't already have at hand. And the difference in my hourly output was measurable. I want to close today with something a little bigger than technique, because I think it is important. Everything in this video is about respect. Respect for your time, respect for your materials, respect for your skills. When I tell you to use pattern weights instead of pins, I am telling you to respect your grain line. When I tell you to press before you cut, I am telling you to respect your fabric. When I tell you to batch your seams, I am telling you to respect your own energy and attention. A lot of sewists I know have a complicated relationship with their craft pile. The stash, the scraps, the box of fabric they bought on sale 3 years ago and have not touched. I want to say something directly about that. Every scrap of fabric in your possession is potential. Seam allowance strips from your last garment project can be cut into prairie points for a quilt binding. The oddly shaped offcuts from a curved piece can become applique elements on a bag or a child's jacket. The remnant from the end of a bolt that you bought because it was too beautiful to leave in the store can become the facing for a coat, so that every time someone sees the inside they see something special. This is resourcefulness. This is the kind of sewing that turns a pile of leftovers into a body of work. I have a small quilt hanging in my workroom right now that contains fabric from 14 different projects. Every piece in it is a scrap that I saved because I could not bring myself to throw away something that still had beauty left in it. That quilt cost me almost nothing in materials. It cost me some focused, efficient weekend hours using every system I have described in this video. And it is one of the most satisfying things I have ever made because I know every inch of what went into it. You are capable of that level of work. You already have most of what you need. What you needed today were the systems, the sequencing, the specific techniques that allow you to close the gap between the vision you have in your head and the thing you actually hold in your hands at the end. Chain piecing closes that gap. Correct stitch length closes that gap. Pressing with intention closes that gap. Batching your work closes that gap. Smart cutting with adding machine tape and rotary blades and pattern weights closes that gap. You do not need to spend more money. You do not need a bigger space. You do not need a new machine. You need a better system, and now you have one. So here is what I want you to do right now before you close this video. Pick one technique from what I shared today. Just one, not all of them. One, maybe it is switching to pattern weights on your next project. Maybe it is finding your adding machine tape and cutting yourself a set of strip guides for that quilt you have been putting off. Maybe it is pressing your fabric before you cut it this afternoon and seeing how different those cut edges feel. One change, implement it on the very next thing you make. And then come back here and tell me in the comments what you changed and what you noticed. I read every comment. I answer as many as I can. This community is how we all get better together and faster together. There is more coming on this channel. I am working on a full deep dive into the mechanics of tension adjustment, including why your top thread tension and your bobbin tension interact the way they do, and how to diagnose and fix any tension problem without calling a technician. I am also putting together a comprehensive guide to building a zero-waste cutting practice that will show you exactly how to rearrange your pattern pieces on the fold, on the bias, and in multi-size nested layouts to get the most usable fabric from every single yard you buy. Both of those are videos I wish someone had made for me 20 years ago, so I am making them for you now. Thank you for spending this time with me today. Keep your blades sharp, Keep your iron hot and keep sewing.